I was sitting on a bench outside a small cafe in Porto when my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number at first. Then I did. I let it ring. A seagull landed on the cobblestones in front of me. The Atlantic wind came in off the river, cool and salt-heavy. I picked up my espresso and watched the seagull until it flew away. By then, the phone had stopped ringing. That was the first time my ex-wife called me in 14 months. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel relieved. I felt something closer to tired. The kind of tired that comes after you've already done all your grieving, and there's nothing left to feel except a quiet, steady peace. But I should probably start from the beginning. My name is Daniel. I'm 52 years old. For 23 years, I was a structural engineer at a mid-sized firm in Columbus, Ohio. I built my career from scratch, started as a junior draftsman, made partner by 40, eventually led the team responsible for some of the larger commercial projects in central Ohio. Nothing flashy, no billionaire story, just hard, consistent work over 2 decades. My ex-wife's name is Sandra. We met when I was 28 and she was 26, at a mutual friend's backyard barbecue in Westerville. She was funny and direct, and had a way of laughing that made you feel like you'd said the most interesting thing anyone had ever said. I was gone for her within a month. We got married 2 years later. We had 2 kids together. My son Tyler is now 24. My daughter Grace just turned 21. Both of them were my whole reason for everything I'd built. Every late night at the office, every weekend sacrificed to a deadline. I told myself it was for them. I believed it too. I still do. The marriage started to change around the time Grace started high school. I don't think there was one specific moment. It was more like watching a house settle, slow, incremental, almost invisible, until one day a crack runs clean across the wall and you realize it's been moving for years. Sandra had gone back to school in her late 30s to get a certification in interior design. I was proud of her for it. She started picking up clients, small residential projects at first, then bigger ones. She was genuinely talented. I told her that often. What I didn't realize, or maybe refused to see, was that her new world was pulling her in a direction I wasn't part of. His name was Garrett. He was a real estate developer, 41 years old, divorced, and apparently in need of an interior designer for a spec home he was flipping in Dublin, Ohio. That's how they met. That's where it started. I didn't find out for almost a year. When I did find out, it wasn't because I went looking. Grace had borrowed Sandra's phone to look something up, and a message came in while it was in her hands. She didn't say anything to me right away. She sat with it for 3 days before she came to my home office one evening, closed the door behind her, and told me what she'd seen. She was shaking when she told me. I remember that more than anything. My daughter standing in front of me, 20 years old, shaking because she had to be the one to break her father's world open. I hugged her for a long time. I told her it wasn't her fault. I told her she did the right thing. I meant every word. That night after she went to bed, I sat in the kitchen alone until about 3 in the morning. I didn't cry. I didn't break anything. I just sat there with a glass of water and let it settle into me. The weight of what I now knew, the weight of everything I was going to have to do next. I confronted Sandra the following morning after the kids left. She didn't deny it. She cried, but not in the way I'd hoped she might. Not out of remorse. She cried the way people cry when they've already made their decision and they just need to get through the hard part of saying it out loud. She told me she hadn't been happy for a long time. She told me she felt like she'd disappeared inside our marriage. She told me Garrett made her feel seen. I listened to all of it. I didn't raise my voice. I asked her once, calmly, directly, if she wanted to try to work through it. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she shook her head. That was that. The divorce took 8 months. I hired a good attorney, a woman named Patricia, who had been through the process herself and had no patience for drawn-out dramatics. We disclosed everything properly, divided assets fairly, worked out a reasonable arrangement. Sandra kept the house. I got a fair settlement. We split the remaining time with the kids, though they were both adults by then and could make their own choices. What happened next is the part that surprised even me. About 2 weeks after the divorce was finalized, Sandra and Garrett got engaged. I heard this through Tyler, who delivered the information in a flat, careful voice the way young men do when they're trying to be neutral about something they're not neutral about at all. I said, "How do you feel about that?" He said, "I don't know yet." I told them that was a completely reasonable answer. 3 months after that, they set a wedding date. 6 months. That's how long it had been since our divorce was final when Sandra walked down an aisle toward another man. I want to be honest here. There was a part of me, a very human part, that felt the sting of that. Not because I wanted her back, I didn't. But because 23 years had apparently been so easy to set aside. Because the life we built together had apparently been nothing more than a backdrop she was ready to leave behind the moment something shinier came along. But here's where I made a decision that changed everything that came after. I didn't fight it. I didn't cause scenes. I didn't say bitter things to the kids about their mother, even on the nights when bitter things were right there on the tip of my tongue. Instead, I focused on something I'd been quietly planning for almost a year. I had always wanted to live abroad. It was one of those dreams I'd shelved in my 20s, when life got practical and busy and full. After the divorce, with both kids grown and independent, there was nothing keeping me in Columbus except inertia. My firm had international connections. I started making calls. By the time Sandra and Garrett were finalizing their wedding invitations, I had accepted a consulting position with a civil engineering firm in Porto, Portugal. 2-year contract, renewable. I gave notice in my firm in Columbus. I sold my car. I put most of my furniture in storage and the rest I gave away. Tyler came to help me pack. He didn't say much, but he worked steadily beside me for 2 full days. And when we finished, he shook my hand and then pulled me into a hug that lasted longer than any hug we'd had since he was a teenager. I had to work hard not to come apart in that moment. Grace didn't come to help me pack. She was polite when I called, but distant in the way she'd been since everything happened. I understood it. She was 21, and her family had fractured, and she was still deciding how to carry all of it. I didn't push. I told her I loved her and that she could reach me anytime, and I meant it, and I left the door open. I flew out of Columbus on a Tuesday morning in March. The flight connected through Newark, and then 9 hours across the Atlantic, and when I landed in Porto and stepped out of the airport into the cool, gray Portuguese morning, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt like myself. I found an apartment in the Bonfim neighborhood. 2nd floor, tall windows, a small balcony that looked out over terracotta rooftops toward the river. I furnished it simply. I learned enough Portuguese to manage daily life. Though most of my colleagues spoke English, I fell into a routine that felt, for the first time in a long time, genuinely mine. Morning coffee at the corner cafe, long walks on weekends, work that challenged me without consuming me. I want to be clear about something. I was not plotting anything. I was not laying some elaborate trap. I had left. I had moved forward. As far as I was concerned, Sandra's choices and their consequences were no longer my concern. But life has a way of arranging its own reckonings. I had stayed in professional contact with a former colleague named Howard, man I'd known for 15 years, sharp, discreet, and thorough in everything he did. Howard had been one of the few people at the firm who knew what had happened in my marriage. Not the dramatic version, just the facts, quietly told. He was not a gossip. He was the opposite of a gossip. But Howard and Garrett moved in some of the same real estate circles in Columbus, as it turned out. A few months after I moved to Porto, Howard sent me an email. It was 3 sentences long. He had come across some information, he said, in the course of normal business dealings. He thought I should know. And he thought I should know before Sandra's sister did. The information was this. Garrett had a pattern. He had been married twice before Sandra. Not once, as he had apparently told her. His second marriage had ended with a civil judgment for financial misconduct related to a joint business venture. The woman he defrauded was not some distant stranger. She was someone who had every reason to want that information to reach the right ears. I read Howard's email twice. Then I picked up the phone and called him. "What are you thinking?" he asked me. I told him I wasn't sure yet. "Whatever you decide," he said. "I've done my part." I spent a few days sitting with it. This was not a decision I was going to make quickly or emotionally. I thought about my kids. I thought about what I wanted the rest of my life to look like. I thought about what kind of man I'd been, and what kind of man I wanted to be, and whether those two things were aligned. In the end, I didn't do anything dramatic. I didn't hire anyone. I didn't show up to the wedding. I did one thing, and one thing only. I contacted the woman, Garrett's second ex-wife, whose name I'll call Margaret, and I told her, simply, that a mutual acquaintance had shared some context with me, that I had been married to someone Garrett was now marrying, and that if she felt there was anything she wished the people in his life knew, I had no objection to her finding a way to say it. I left it entirely in her hands. I went back to my life in Porto. I had a project deadline. I took a weekend trip to Sintra with a colleague named Anna who was showing me the parts of Portugal that tourists miss. I stopped thinking about Columbus. The wedding took place on a Saturday in October. I know this because Tyler texted me that morning. A short text, just checking in, not mentioning the wedding directly, but clearly thinking about it. I texted him back, told him I was having a slow Saturday morning and the weather in Porto was excellent. He sent back a single thumbs up emoji. That was enough. What happened at the wedding, I learned in pieces over the following weeks. Margaret had attended. Not as a crasher. She had apparently reached out to a mutual contact of Garrett's family, someone who was on the guest list, and had asked if she could come as their guest. The contact, for reasons I don't fully understand and didn't ask too many questions about, had said yes. During the reception, Margaret had stood up. I'm told the room went quiet quickly because she carried herself with a kind of stillness that commanded attention. She didn't shout. She didn't make a scene in the conventional sense. She simply said, clearly and calmly, that she wished the couple well and that she also felt it was important to let everyone know that she had been Garrett's wife, his second wife, and that their marriage had ended with a court judgment that she was still, in fact, attempting to recover from. Then she sat down. That was it. 8 seconds, maybe 10. She didn't elaborate. She didn't perform. She said what she had to say and she sat down. The wedding did not stop. People got married. But the room, by all accounts, was never quite the same after that moment. Questions started circulating almost immediately. Among guests, among Sandra's family, among people who had believed Garrett's version of his own history. One wedding became the beginning of a much longer unraveling. Within 6 weeks of the wedding, Garrett's business dealings were under informal scrutiny from 2 separate parties who had been emboldened by what Margaret said. Tyler told me that Sandra had gone very quiet, that she wasn't posting on social media anymore, that she seemed to be realizing slowly and painfully that the man she had upended her life for was not who she had believed him to be. I did not feel victorious when Tyler told me this. I want to be precise about that. What I felt was something closer to sad, not for Garrett, but for Sandra, not because she deserved protection from the truth, but because I had spent 23 years with that woman, and some part of me that was still intact would always remember who she had been before she made the choices she made. Watching someone walk into a wall they couldn't see coming doesn't feel like a win. It just feels like watching someone walk into a wall. What I did feel, deeply, unexpectedly, was something shift with grace. About 2 months after the wedding, my daughter called me. Not a text, an actual phone call, which from a 21-year-old is the equivalent of sending a handwritten letter. She called on a Sunday evening my time, which meant early afternoon for her in Columbus. I was on my balcony with a book when the phone rang. She said, "Dad, do you have a few minutes?" I set the book down and said, "I have as many minutes as you need." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I owe you an apology." I told her she didn't owe me anything. She said, "I do. I was cold to you when you left. I was still trying to make sense of everything. And I think I blamed you for leaving instead of understanding why you had to go. That wasn't fair." I didn't rush to fill the silence. I let her say what she needed to say. She said, "I know what happened at the wedding. I know about Garrett's history, and I know that Mom is having a really hard time right now." She paused. "I'm not calling about any of that. I'm calling because I miss you. I'm calling because I want to come visit." I had to take a breath before I could answer. She came in December, just before Christmas. 2 weeks in Porto, the 2 best weeks I'd had in longer than I could remember. I showed her the city, the bridges, the viewpoints at dusk where the whole river lights up gold. We walked until our feet ached. We ate dinner late the way the Portuguese do, talking across small tables with a candle between us, and I learned things about my daughter I hadn't known before. Who she was becoming, what she was thinking about, what kind of life she was trying to build. On her last night, we sat on my balcony after dinner. She had a glass of wine. I had my usual espresso, even at 10 at night, because old habits. She said, "You seem genuinely happy here, Dad." I said, "I am." She said, "That's all I needed to see." Sandra called me for the first time on a Thursday morning about a month after that. The call I mentioned at the beginning. The one I let ring. She called again 4 days later. I picked up that time. She sounded smaller than I remembered. Not defeated. Sandra was never someone who allowed herself to be fully defeated, but quieter. Reduced somehow. She said she was sorry. She said she'd been foolish. She said she'd been foolish. She said she hadn't understood what she had. I listened to all of it. I didn't argue with any of it. When she finished, I said, "I appreciate you saying that, Sandra. I genuinely do." She asked if we could talk more. Maybe meet sometime, if I was ever back in the States. I said, "I don't think that's something I need, but I hope you're able to find your footing. I mean that." There was a long pause. Then she said, "You're really okay, aren't you?" It wasn't quite a question. I said, "Yeah, I really am. I've thought a lot about what it means to leave cleanly, not to run away, but to remove yourself from a story that was never going to end well and let it finish without you. People will sometimes interpret that as weakness, as giving up, as not fighting for what's yours. But I'd spent 23 years fighting for something that turned out to be one-sided. And I knew by the end that no amount of fighting was going to change the fundamental nature of what had gone wrong. The strongest thing I ever did was stop trying to fix something that didn't want to be fixed and redirect that energy towards something new. Tyler came to visit in February. He brought his girlfriend, a woman named Jess who grew up in Pittsburgh and had strong opinions about good bread and was therefore extremely well suited to a long weekend in Porto. Watching my son walk through my adopted city, watching him relax in a way I don't often see him relax, watching him look at me with something that had moved past worry into something steadier, that was worth more to me than any vindication. On the morning they left, Tyler shook my hand at the door. Then he pulled me into another one of those long hugs. He said quietly into my shoulder, "I'm proud of you, Dad." I didn't have words for that. I just held on a little longer. I renewed my contract with the firm for another 2 years. I started picking up some Portuguese. Not just functional phrases, but actual conversational Portuguese, which apparently delights the older men at the cafe, who I think had decided I was a lost cause. My apartment in Bonfim still has the same view of the terracotta rooftops, and I've added a second chair to the balcony now, for when people visit. I don't know what Sandra's life looks like now in any detail. I've heard through Tyler that things with Garrett have become complicated in ways that I won't go into. What I know is that it's no longer my story to follow. I know some people will wonder whether I orchestrated what happened at the wedding. I'll say this. I gave a woman the information she already had, and I got out of the way. Everything that followed was the result of truth. Nothing more and nothing less. I don't lose sleep over it. What I do think about, sometimes in the early mornings when the light is still soft and the city is just waking up, is the version of myself that might have stayed, that might have stewed in Columbus, growing smaller and more bitter, letting the injury define the rest of his life. That man had every reason to exist. The circumstances would have justified him completely. I chose a different version. The seagull came back the next morning. Same bench, same cafe, same Atlantic wind off the river. I had my espresso. I had my book. I had a text from Grace that said she was looking at flights for spring. I typed back, "Come whenever you want. The second chair is yours." Then I put the phone in my pocket, turned my face toward the water, and let the morning be exactly what it was,